A new report by Amnesty International says marginalized groups, including the LGBTIQ+ community, sex workers and homeless people, were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 regulations that expose them to further discrimination and human rights abuses. The report documents how an overly punitive approach to the enforcement of regulations saw people jailed for non-compliance with public health measures, mostly impacting the marginalized. Well, for more on this, we're joined by the Executive Director, Amnesty International, Shenilla Mohamed. Shenilla, good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Firstly, I mean, are there particular reasons why it is that marginalized groups were seen to have suffered the most under the lockdown?
Good evening, Kathy, and good evening to your viewers. Well, you know, this report, which is really based on an online survey of 54 civil society organizations in 28 countries, including South Africa, really documented how in countries where there were already very stringent sort of rules and regulations and COVID-19 enforcement, it was actually these people that bore the brunt of it. So it saw people being fined, arrested, jailed for non-compliance, and this resulted in people who were already marginalized by a system that was not friendly towards them, actually facing increased harassment and violence, particularly from police security forces, but also not being able to access essential services, including food, healthcare, and housing. So this over-punitive approach, you know, took people who are already suffering in society, who are already unequal, who already did not have the access to basic human rights, to further exacerbate their rights violations. And I think that is really the result of unequal societies, but also the enforcement of punitive measures.
Shenilla, does the research or the survey make a distinction between how just ordinary people who don't fall under the specific group of marginalized people were affected by the lockdown versus this distinction that is being made? So I suppose what I'm saying is that the issues that are being listed are issues that were faced by all people in general. If we take a look at a country like South Africa, the victimization didn't stop at just marginalized groups. And so how do you make that distinction?
Well, you know, what we looked at was, you know, the rights violations that normal or people, you know, who don't fall into these marginalized groups were experiencing versus the rights violations that the marginalized groups were experiencing. And we felt that, you know, it was very clear that, yes, there were violations of rights for people outside of these marginalized groups, you know, for the normal average South African, because, you know, we saw that unfolding in South Africa in front of our eyes, where, you know, excessive use of force, where people died, you know, because once the soldiers were put down in townships, etc. We saw the way in which people's rights were violated, you know, where people went out to buy stuff, and if it fell out of curfew times, they were being arrested or their rights were violated. But I think what this report points to is that while there was a rights violation of people, you know, of average people, those in the marginalized groups felt it even more severely and even harsher, because, you know, they already were having their rights violated. They were already living under unequal situations where housing was a problem, where access to healthcare was a problem. And actually under COVID, these were further exacerbated because, you know, they weren't able to then go to the shelters. They weren't able to then go to food kitchens. They weren't able to access even the meager amounts of support that they would normally get. And I think that is the big distinction, is that people who are unequal, who live in you know, difficult conditions, were even further had their rights violated during COVID. And I think, you know, what was really disturbing was that the states, and many states, not just South Africa, decided to adopt a punitive approach instead of a supportive approach. And so we saw that, you know, for example, in South Africa, we saw the emergency law that kept on getting renewed, and that came with its own human rights challenges. And yet, what would have been better would have been a much more supportive approach, where people were not all lumped into one category, that those that are marginalized, those that are suffering, would have been dealt with in a different way. But we did not see that. We saw a punitive approach, and we saw people's rights being further violated.
I hear you on what you're saying, Shenilla, but I suppose in many respects, it would also be instructive to look at what individual countries did, because we're speaking in such broad strokes right now, because we know, even you talk about the issue of homes and people being evicted, when we know that there were some countries, including South Africa, where people were actually offered a degree of protection under the lockdown due to the fact that, evictions were not allowed to be carried out during that period, much of which has now that it has been lifted, we're seeing a spate and a resurgence of evictions take place.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, our report shows that some countries like South Africa, it did impose temporary moratoriums on evictions, and they introduced temporary emergency accommodation measures, including the use of empty buildings. But, in many cases, the provision of these temporary shelters or moratoriums really were not up to standard. And yes, definitely people were not being evicted. But the reality is that people's rights were still being violated, and that governments, including South Africa, failed to protect people, from rights abuses, even during the state-provided emergency accommodation centers. So, I mean, we saw hugely unsanitary conditions. We saw sexual and gender-based violence in many, many of these places around the world. And, of course, the use of excessive force from security guards. Now, in South Africa, one of the things that the report shows is that local governments were mandated to set up shelters for people experiencing homelessness, and this was not being done. And they were also given powers to forcibly evacuate people to such sites. So, Kathy, that is already a violation of their rights. If you are forcibly evacuating people and forcing them to go into these places, then you are already violating their rights. And then, of course, we saw that the use of police to enforce these measures really did increase people's fears, and especially people who were homeless, that they would be pressurized to go and to be put into a camp. And so, we saw a whole breakdown of rights while the state used COVID to try to justify the reasons for doing what it did. So yes, while there was a moratorium on evictions, people were being forced to go into these shelters. So again, you have to balance the whole issue of rights protection versus the necessary rights violations that were taking place under the guise of COVID.